Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill today. If you didn't catch the earlier show with my Norwegian guest about the MTB operations, it's an absolute doozy. Go back and watch that one. But now, how do we Brits memorialize the Second World War and those that preceded and those that followed? Dr. Tessa Dunlop explores this in her super new book called Lest We Forget. Here's my copy here. War and Peace in 100 Monuments. And I can't wait to have this conversation because memorials living in Normandy, I live with them, they're everywhere, and I want to hear what Tessa has to say about the British version. So, good evening. How are you today?
Hello, I'm really delighted to be on this platform. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad you're here. So, what we were just talking about, and now we'll talk about in front of the audience, is I've always understood that the interpretation of the wars themselves has gone through phases, and we now call that the historiography of it, and there's the eras. But it hadn't really occurred to me until I kind of started thumbing through your book that the way we memorialize it has also gone through all these phases from Victorian era. And we must stress that your book doesn't just cover World War II; it's the whole plethora. So you must have had an initial idea that sparked this off. Were you in front of a particular monument? Did you have like a eureka moment? What was the thought process?
That's a good question. Actually, it's a bit more prosaic than that. My mum nobody ever believes me, but I spent my first 20 years in the Highlands of Scotland. My father worked for a laird, a landowner, and in a very, very remote Highland village. And I always felt you can cope with the hideosity in many ways of Southeast London if you know you've got home to go to. So even at my later stages in life, I always knew I had home. Every holiday, every bank, every time I could get out, I got there. And suddenly mum widowed said, I'm leaving. I'm up sticks. I'm going. She was English. She married an English woman, hence my voice. And I felt this grief I still haven't fully got over. And in that, very looking down the Loch Rannoch onto Glencoe, hugely remote. Well, in fact, the Moor of Rannoch is the last known wilderness in Britain. It's the most uninhabited, unbuilt on place in Britain. And I went to the Loch's End and I stood by the cairn, otherwise known as the Kinlochrannoch War Memorial, because it's really the only piece of public art, as was the case writ large across the whole of Britain in the wake of World War One. And I was standing there with a bloody gale blowing in my face. And the reason why it resonated was because every single November armistice, out we troop with Peter, the garage mechanic, who was also the piper, walking behind his kilt, swinging out. And we were freezing and we never gave a thought to what we were doing. It was all performative because we were kids. It was freezing cold. And suddenly I'm there, with a history hat on several decades later. And I look at this war memorial and I think, James, how did I never notice that on a Highland cairn, there is an American Air Force man commemorated on a Scottish cairn. I said, what is that doing there? How and what? And then because actually I'm an oral historian, we've talked before, I've done Army Girls and Bletchley Girls and predominantly the female legacy of World War II. I was like, well, I'm going to find out because I belong to this village. And I went to school with Mackenzies and with Blacks and with Duncans. And it was a Mackenzie who was on, it was one of several Mackenzies, but this was an American Mackenzie. And so I go to the oldest person in the village, Anne Gerber, ironically married to a German. And she's like, yeah, that was my uncle. That was my uncle on the War Memorial. And she told me this absolutely spellbinding story. We'll get a picture up actually of the War Memorial. We'll just flick through as we're going. Wait a sec. This is just a PowerPoint. Oh, there we are. I've overshot it. So there we are. It's a classic Scottish cairn facing down the loch. You can see why no kiddie wanted to stand in front of that in November. And
I feel cold looking at
it. Yeah, exactly. And this is the buy one, get one free bit for World War II. We'll come to that in a minute about the difference between World War One and World War II when it comes to commemoration. But it was so interesting. Of course, it was classic emigration from Britain between the wars, especially to America, go and earn your fortune, big family, especially from Scotland. He goes to leave to make his fortune. He thinks he's gamed it out of the war, because one of his brothers, also named on the memorial, loses his life in 1940 as a naval cadet. But he thinks he's out of the war until, of course, Pearl Harbor. And then she remembers age 6, this Anne Gerber, who's now in her late 80s. She remembers larger than life. Her uncle striding into wee Kinlochrannoch, the village, all his American gloss, hot chocolate in a polystyrene wrapper, shiny apples, wonderful uniform. And of course, 6 weeks later, he's dead. And his sister Morag fights tooth and nail to get her other brother, on that memorial. And what's so interesting about this memorial, and I know the laird, the landowner, because my dad worked for him, is that unlike all the other memorials erected in the wake of World War I onwards, almost all of them, it's not done alphabetically, i.e. the dead who have served are equal in death. It's done by rank. So he's not even next to his brother. He's a different rank. So he's from his brother Mackenzie. But for me, that she brought it to life. And then the ironic twist, of course, is that there she is worrying about her German grandson, where they're currently talking about conscription, how war comes full circle, how commemoration lives through the different generations, this kind of ongoing heartbeat. And it just, for me, was also an excuse to anchor myself to that village that my mum's now left. So there you are. That was a rather long-winded way of explaining.
Well, but a really good story, and it leads me to my next question, in that, who are memorials for? Because I would imagine during the process of writing this book that you're probably further away from answering that question in some ways than when you started, because there's they're sort of connected with graves, how we put a gravestone to someone we knew, someone we actually, our own relatives, our own we have that marker there for some, but there's also this sense that they're for society, whatever that means, they're for the population, they're for recognition. So do you have a sort of a category system, the Dr. Tessa Dunlop category system? What tell us about what memorials are, really?
Now, that's a really good question. First of all, you're not working with two timelines when you write this book. I didn't really realize what I'd taken on. You're working with three, because you're working with the timeline of the individual or individuals who are being commemorated.
Yep.
You're working with the period that chooses to commemorate them, and you're working with their interaction in today's society.
Yes.
So that's three timelines. So I'm going to take, we're just going to whip you back to the beginning of that PowerPoint, if I may. So I go and see my favorite Bletchley girl, Ruth Bourne, who immediately says, well, for me, if I'm going to talk, she's a liberal Jewish woman. She worked on the bomb machine, which was the Alan Turing invention. Her father was a GP. She says our generation didn't just walk the Arc of War. We walked societal change that was unprecedented. She said, and I served in the war under a man who believed he was helping win for freedom in Britain, to then discover he was not free. Alan Turing, of course, who dies because he's convicted of homosexuality and commits suicide. So her choice of monument is the Alan Turing statue, not the one in Bletchley Park, which commemorates exclusively his war service, but actually the one that backs onto the gay village in Manchester, where he later served in the computer science laboratories, and also backs onto the gay village. But what's interesting about Ruth is then we talk further, and I realize I can't play an audio clip, but I'll just tell you what she says. She says, I don't understand war. She's also deeply perturbed by what she sees in her 100th year, this woman who's watching it unfold again on the east of Europe, and likewise with a sort of invested stake, at least emotionally, as a Jewish woman, a liberal, watching what's playing out in the Middle East and just struggling to make sense of it all. And she said, oh, it's because, men this and men that. And I said, are you parking this exclusively at men? And she said, well, with the exception of Boadicea, I can't think of any other woman who started a war. So I then think, right, that's going to be my start point, where I'm going to take this journey to start. And I go to see Boudica, as we now call her, with a group of primary school children, because I think because it's on the key stage 2 curriculum, Boudica, as this great kind of British patriot, even though, of course, ideas of Britain, were farcical. It wasn't even in England back then. And I check her out, and I realized that key stage 2 learning is not going to work for what I want to write about, because she's there, and on her chariot behind her are these 2 daughters who were raped. No wonder Boudica rampages and ruins Colchester, St Albans and Londinium. This is a response to the ultimate, now seen as one of the most ghastly weapons of war, sexual violence. And and this was the echo, of course, on the 7th of October. Only in the 20th century is sexual violence recognized as a weapon of war. And so I'm thinking, okay, that Boudica's, and of course also Boudica is this great imperial icon. This is commissioned under Victoria's reign. Actually, it's unveiled in the first year of her son Edward VII's reign. So there you have the answer to your question. That's not even touching on the Second World War. Forgive me for the detour. But there's 3, you're talking about ancient Britain, or the ancient Icenian tribe. You're talking about Victorian Britain, who wants to use a freedom fighter to celebrate their their own empire. Hope you're keeping up here, Paul.
Yeah.
And also about key stage 2 in the curriculum and sexual violence.
Wow. I mean, that has pretty much answered my question about what memorials are. It's all to do with context and what you see in it yourself. Is that, I mean, when we get to World War II, I think, and living in Normandy, we were chatting before going on. I mean, there's thousands of them here in memorials, and they range from little streets named after individuals to tanks sitting on concrete plinths, and they all come under that banner of a memorial. But some of them are very, as I was saying to you before going live, Helen Patton, my friend, she says, why are so many of them dick-shaped? Why are so many of them phallic? I mean, and it's an intriguing question, who are they for, who built them, and why? And your journey.
Let me help you answer that question.
Sorry?
With some visual imagery. I said,
yeah,
let
with
me
imagery.
help you answer
Yes,
that question.
Yeah. I mean,
and here we have Nelson's column.
Yes, exactly. I mean, which is still a subject of many schoolboy gags when I was a kid, And I mean, when you mentioned Boudica, I remember it's because I'm from Colchester. I remember at primary school we were drawing a picture of Boudica based on something in the book, but we weren't allowed to have her with her tits out. That the picture in the book did. The picture in the book had her charging naked from the, but we weren't allowed to do that. And I even at like 7, that all seemed very weird, and what was going on. And I thought, isn't this about revolution? It's a I'll hand it back to you to kind of lead us through some of the more things you discover, then we'll bounce some ideas around. It's really interesting, this conversation.
Well, thank you for that, Paul, because I've got to be honest, I'm just going to be really candid here. And by the way, thanks for anyone who's tuned in. I didn't expect, I mean, I write normally to a kind of reasonably populous market, women's stories, veteran stories. It's quite a soft landing. And actually it is, I think this is more important, this conversation, but it's a harder sell. It's a harder sell because there is a lot of willy waving when it comes to talking about war, particularly the Second World War, but not only. I mean, if we were talking 100 years ago, the willy waving would be done around the Napoleonic era, and little boys would be playing with French soldiers, not German ones. So it's not new to any particular generation, and also it's quite gendered. So I think when I write about particularly women, there's that feeling of catch up, and therefore a moment in the sun. And it's okay if it's not willy waving, what is it? But it is definitely a moment of pride, but it is a softer landing. Especially as women were invariably, although not exclusively, but they didn't tend to be. They certainly were non-combatants officially, although unofficially we know there were a few in the SOE, etc., who were armed. But in response to the design of the monumentation and who it's erected by and for, I think for me, the big push-off point for monumentation as we know it today happens in the 19th century, particularly in the Victorian period, where we're really getting it together in terms of the sum of our parts, Great Britain, and what we can achieve. And that's where you see all this kind of belated Napoleonic and Wellington iconography. It's in that period after the Napoleonic Wars, early Victorian. And it's one man tells the story for every fallen man. And actually, there isn't really even a postscript for the fallen men. I went to after Wellington's great victory, we busted flush. This is Wellington Arch, by the way, and that's the original Wellington on Copenhagen that was up on the top of the arch until it was deemed too much of an eyesore. I mean, I don't know if you know where that giant, disproportionate Wellington now sits. Do you know where he's gone to?
No.
It's a wonderful story. Basically, everyone in London is apoplectic. Mid-19th century, 19th century. They think this can't be true. On our lovely arch, it was originally called the Green Park Arch. I hope I haven't got that wrong. But anyway, it wasn't called Wellington Arch. That's the main thing you need to know. It was renamed because, of course, naming things is a cheap way to get your victory message out. It doesn't cost you anything to call a bridge Waterloo Bridge or an arch Wellington Arch. And it spreads the word Britain won that war. And then they stick Wellington on the top to flatter him because he doesn't die. He lives on and on and on. He's a bit like old Victoria. And then they think we can't take it down. It's really ugly, but we can't take it down because he's alive. And it only gets removed when there's so much traffic going around Hyde Park Corner that the arch itself needs moved. And so it's for a traffic expansion scheme. And then he's never put back on. But here he is in Aldershot. You can see him there. That's him in Aldershot.
Aldershot,
and that's yeah, you see, because the military barracks, which incidentally, for your World War II favourite facts, apparently Hitler had his eye on it, and he had said, don't bomb Aldershot. It's a great military centre, and it's exactly mid-distance between London and the Channel. We'll need it. So it was not touched in the Blitz. So the story has it. Anyway, all these big to one man icons are very much the hero worship. It's about telling everyone we're Great Britain. And you see as many of them, by the way, in Scotland, even the stuff that supports Scottish heroes from a different era. So this is the Wallace Monument, but it's built in the late Victorian period. It's all about Great Britain, really. That's the truth. The kind of viciousness of Wallace versus the English is massively played down in the Wallace Monument. It's much more about a baronial Scottish style within a Great British narrative. And even though Wellington never went to Scotland, there's loads of Wellingtons in Scotland, for example. So to move it on, the sea change really occurs not in the First World War, but the Boer War, when we fight in South Africa at the end of the Victorian period, where you see about 25,000 yeomanry volunteers die. Mainly, it's got to be said, of disease, but also of German machine gun bullets fired by the Dutch farmers. The very beginning of this recognition of the private and the ordinary soldier actually starts earlier in the Crimean War. And the first war memorial I found to name just a simple able seaman was in Bath Abbey Cemetery in Bath, 13 men of every rank. And that is erected in 1856. That's the first time I could find, I'd be interested of any other record of a public memorial. And that, of course, is because that's when you first get the press camping alongside the soldiers in the Crimean
Of
War.
course. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you see, I know this is the Second World War, but it brings us on.
No, it's all relevant. You know, when you talk about those monuments to the likes of the Wellington and Generals, is that also because of it's like simplifying the conflict as well? Because we know we're in an era now when we can just walk into a bookstore and we can get a choice of books on any conflict we want, and it's there, all information with all the maps there. But we're going back, you know, when you're saying the 19th, we're going back to a much more limited press and explaining how a war unfolded, and the Napoleonic War involves people from Germany and Russia. And so just saying, oh, well, it's all about a general. It's a way of just simplifying it and saying, yeah, we won and he was in charge.
Yeah, and by the way, really interesting. Of course, it was famously a coalition, and yet the Strand Bridge, renamed conveniently, it was about to reach completion, renamed the Waterloo Bridge, opened very early. I think it's 1817 it's opened. Very few flags other than the Great British Union Jack. You would hardly know there'd been, you know, the Prussian, Dutch, etc. presence. You really wouldn't. And that use of the word Waterloo, fascinating. The only money the government put up towards building to victory was 600 Anglican churches, the first of which, Holy Trinity, is in King's Weston in Bristol. And of course, they were the Waterloo churches. Praise be to the Lord, we are the greatest. And actually, I think you were more likely to feature in a dental catalogue, your teeth were, because of course, everyone raked over the battlefield. So you'd take it was not just a sort of tourist trail to go over and check out the battlefield, but also people scavenged anything they could take, including dentures, which were then resurfaced, or teeth, I should say, and resurfaced and used as a mold. So a young soldier, great pair of gnashes, thanks very much. I'll have a set of his, thank you, for my dentures.
Wow. I want to go to World War I and World War II, because one of the things we talk about on this channel is that you can't understand one without the second one without understanding the first one. And we talk about doctrine and the development of the aviation and infantry tactics, etc., etc. But in my mind, and you're the expert because you've written the book, the way we commemorate the First World War is very different to the way we celebrate the Second World War, at least by the monuments they were put up. What did you find?
First thing I discover is the seismic shock. And I think that's got lost in quite a lot of, and I don't criticize it, but I think we have to own that we use the word celebration around VE Day and around a lot of our World War II commemoration today. But if you go back to the First World War and you think of the numbers of casualties, the flower of Britain's young males had been mown down and beyond, in the Commonwealth too. So well in excess of 1 million men, including Commonwealth soldiers, just under 1 million if you're just looking exclusively at British soldiers. And that was incredibly painful to manage. Actually, to get a handle on what that was, I spoke to a couple of mothers who'd lost their sons in Afghanistan.
Right.
And I tried to understand their pain. Like the grief is like a room without a door, because when you lose your child against the natural order in a conflict you don't fully understand, a bit like World War I, a bit like Afghanistan. And you then try and imagine multiplying that by 1 million. That's really hard to get your head around. So at the end of World War I, Peace Day quickly becomes a commemoration day, a remembrance day. Victory Day doesn't really exist. It's remembrance and peace and pain. And you get this extraordinary cenotaph, which really, I think, like no other monument, stands the test of time. It is graceful. It is easy on the eye. I don't think it's genderless. I think the Glorious Dead, I think predominantly in the cenotaph, we think of as male, but it is no religious symbolism, which was incredibly far-sighted for the time. No national symbolism. Those flags, you'll notice, are contemporary flags, so they can be changed. That was also very far-sighted. This other one, by the way, is both these, of course, are cenotaphs, memorials to also World War II. So coming on to your question, but this other cenotaph is the only one designed by a woman, and it's in Bristol. 0.01% of architects were women, so this is very rare, and it's actually on it. It's to the sons and daughters of World War I, and that's another very rare case. But World War II. So if you think of the primary, the belly button of commemoration being the cenotaph, you then get these iterations of grief right across the country, in every village, market square, in every town, in every city, in different forms, in scrolls, in monuments, in cairns, in crosses, in the wake of World War I. So what you have between the wars is public art in a form and in a quantity we've never seen before. And then you come to World War II, and World War II is defined by two things in the face of World War I. There's a blitz. So there's an F, there's a war from above. So you have approximately 1 million houses taken out and damaged, which you don't have in World War I. So if you need to build, I just need to, by the way, I think I haven't plugged in my computer and I'm having a panic. You might lose me any minute. One sec.
Okay, no worries. Plug it in.
In the middle of this live stream, I need you to hold fort.
No worries. We'll keep on going. And folks, the link to Tessa's book is in the description below. And yeah, no, I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation, as I knew I would.
Oh, thank you, Paul. So I'm back. Just suddenly the light dimmed. I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be a blackout.
Oh, so, no, don't leave me hanging. Yeah, no.
I won't leave you hanging. So so you have the Blitz, and therefore pressure on building anything is on building not just homes for heroes, but patching up the streets in Britain. I mean, most streets you walk down look like they were missing a tooth. You know, that's what one veteran likened it to me. And the other feeling was, and I spoke to Phil, I relied heavily on my veteran testimony, and the veterans that I've got to know. And I met new ones because I took on board men this time. My oldest is Colin Bell, DFC.
Yeah, lovely Colin Bell. Yeah, what a legend.
Yeah. In fact, I must get him on your channel. Let's get him on for Armistice this year. But that's a different story.
Let's do that. Yeah.
He's very, very good at tech. So, and Philip, who'd lost his brother in the war, lost his sister-in-law in the Second World War, and lost his best friend in World War II, said at the end of World War II, there was this feeling that monuments didn't and hadn't worked. They hadn't stopped a second war. And therefore, you kind of get a buy one, get one free when it comes initially at the end of World War II, where all these commemorative structures, and the cenotaph hasn't got names on it, but most of them do, are asked to budge up. The Royal Artillery Memorial in Hyde Park Corner is a classic example where there's a sort of extra plate at the front commemorating, I think it's the 29,000 servicemen and women, including actually the eightieth who served on gun sites in World War II, who fell and were killed. Now, what's interesting is I don't think for our generation, Paul, and I speak for myself here, and people may feel differently about this, I'd be interested to know, that I ever really took that on board. I didn't, but even in that Scottish cairn, it's sort of like conveniently they found a space to just pop in that plaque. And there was a third feeling about not commemorating war massively. And by the way, if you look in the newspapers, the establishment papers, when I say that, I mean the Mail, the Telegraph, the Times, there are no big anniversary events around celebrating World War II until the 80s. Not really. There really weren't. There were to celebrate specific men, individuals, leaders who died, because you get the great war leaders like Churchill, Alan Brooke, Montgomery, etc. But a lot of them aren't really dying till the 80s anyway. And then you'll get a big event, or even Bomber Harris, but that's later
Yeah.
in the 90s.
Yeah.
But generally, you're not getting your set piece May the 8th, D-Day landing anniversaries until the 1980s. We'll explain why in a minute. And as Philip said to me, and there was a secondary feeling as well, Tessa, although he had lost several players in the war, including a brother, he said a lot of people felt they'd got away relatively lightly compared to the First World War. So there wasn't this groundswell as we have to express our grief. It had been a longer war, nearly 6 years, and half the number were killed. So although it seems gargantuan, the numbers today, 380,000, relative to the war before, where double the number of young men had killed in a shorter time span, there was a feeling that it could have been worse. So all those feelings conflate together and result in commemorative iterations that are specific to services. And this is probably the most famous, this one. And it is erected in 1952. I'm sure you've been there, haven't you?
I haven't actually. No, I haven't. It's on my list, but no, I haven't been there.
Right. Well, you're probably saturated.
I know it's Acclaimed. I want to go there, but I haven't been there.
Well, if you choose a day like I chose, it's going to be the only time you get to take in the men on your own. It absolutely pushed it down, to use a Scottish expression. And I got 2 speeding tickets because I did Culloden on the same day, and I was in my mum's Fiat. And I didn't even know that my mum's Fiat could go fast enough. But on the A9 at 8 o'clock in the morning, it's amazing. They track you like nobody's business. So I got 2 speeding tickets in 15 minutes, and I didn't go over 70. But there we go. That's the SMP. So, but what was interesting about this is to an exclusive service invented by Churchill to accommodate the needs and challenges of World War II, the Commandos.
Yeah.
It's also super masculine. And Paul, you can talk to the masculine narrative that emerges from World War II.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's it's got weapons on it. It's the stance and all that aspect of it there is there. And I think you're right. It means more than just the Commandos. It's a monument to the concept of the Churchill spirit, isn't it? The having a go, fighting back, taking the war to them. It's almost. And I'm not saying anything wrong with it. It's sort of aggressive. It's celebrating militariness as opposed to commemorating loss. Although it does both. If that doesn't sound paradoxically, you know what I mean.
Yeah, and interestingly, I wanted to bring each monument to life. And I thought, and the Commandos, by the way, there's the most fantastic Commando Association, and they were unbelievably helpful. Like, I can't tell you what a great organization it was, run by David. He'd served in the Falklands, he'd served in Iraq, he'd been through it, he'd trained in the jungle, trained in Norway in the snow, and he was absolutely brilliant. There's 2 things about this monument, if you ever go to see it in Acclaimed. One is that it's the most visited war memorial, I think I'm right in saying, in Scotland. So even on that terrible day, there were buses pulling in as I was leaving. It does, on a good day, you can have the most spectacular view onto Ben Nevis. And Acclaimed, of course, was the training centre. That idea that you are, and I think monuments, when they work best, inhabit their landscape. So this is where you arrive on a train. And I spoke to one of the guys who trained as a commander in World War II, although he just missed fighting in the conflict. And he said, yeah, it's true. You had to do, I think it was a 7-mile march. And if you didn't do it in a certain time, you were sent back to base. You were rejected. Like, this was tough from the get-go. And I think because of the weather on the day I got there, I couldn't even get my mum out of the car. Actually, this is all about a tough, exclusive male war, which I think really grew legs after the Second World War. Britain was, if we think we've had a cost of living crisis now, it was pretty bleak in the 50s. And then you're going to have the imperial abyss facing down this kind of questionable British identity when the empire comes home. And people feel challenged by that. The idea of the foreigner, even though the foreigner thought they were British, thank you very much. coming into Britain and us having to shed our empire. And that means you have to talk up this man's war. So the one thing every little schoolboy wanted to be in the 50s and 60s was brave. And all those films, you know, Bridge Over the River Kwai, you can list the films. Prince Philip loved those films, by the way. They speak to this monument. But I then did a 180-degree turn, and at the back of the monument is the memorial garden. And in that garden are plaques individually erected by those who've fallen in service as commandos since the Second World War. And it was unbelievably painful. These eternally young men, because they'll never grow old, who died in Northern Ireland, in the Falklands, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and made a mockery, and I really increasingly wrote to this, of that idea of peacetime Britain is such a load of bullshit. We've not been at peace in a single decade since the Second World War.
We had 18 months in the 20th century or something where the British Army was not engaged, something like that, wasn't it? It's a ridiculously low number, and there's not much different.
I think this is one of our longest. Yeah, I think this is one of our longest peacetimes right now. But in that garden of sea of plaques and memorials was this one little man had written, "I want to understand more about my grandfather's service. Call this number." So I called it, right? And I chat to this guy called Alan. I've got my book out now so I can remember the details of Alan's dad, John Marnes. And he was absolutely fascinating about his dad's service. It was a bit hazy, a bit opaque, because he didn't know much because his dad hated talking about it. He was a fantastic athlete, a brilliant swimmer. He was selected for the Commandos. His aunt never knew where John went. He'd go away for months on end and come back and not talk about it. And one of the knives, the Commando knives, which is on that memorial, John had. And on the scabbard, there's 5 lines scored across it for each of John Marnes's kills. And he was absolutely weighed down by the weight of his war.
Wow, yeah.
Alan said it destroyed my dad. And so that on the one hand, you have this incredibly kind of masculine monument. And John liked the monument. He remembered his fallen comrades at the monument, but he felt very, very worried about the way in which commemoration was lionizing war. Now, I would say you've got to lionize war to get the recruits in. But if you fought a war, you fought as a commando, and you've taken 5 notches on your scabbard. And he said, his son kept saying, it was kill or be killed. That was my dad's war, kill or be killed. And to me, that monument is kill or be killed. And I think it's so easy to sanitize ideas. The further away we get from the Second World War, we kind of fluff it up. We think that the people who fought were 100 years old, I think now, because we cast it through the lens of this tiny brigade of ever increasingly old veterans.
I'm going to have to get you to have a chat with Helen Patton, because you'd be right up her street in this idea of how we remember it. And don't get me started on middle-aged or elderly reenactors dressed as... Anyway, there was a good comment came in very early from Trevor about, he says, national mood post-World War I became a factor in government thinking at a time when revolutions were breaking out in Europe, which is a good point. There's commemoration going on in the UK, but Russia is heralding a new and darker age. But what the memorials, in the broad sense, they bring people together. And I suppose the nation in some ways was never more together than at the end of World War I, because there had been all that shared loss. Whether you're an aristocrat or a poor person, you'd probably lost someone in the war. Whereas if the other things that are mentioned by governments, I don't know, unions or labor laws or taxes, the country immediately is divided on opinion because people have different, but honoring the war dead, could it be politicized to unite people?
Well, there were strikers who protested in the 1920s, because remember, it was a time of terrible social turmoil, huge unemployment. They coalesced around the cenotaph. So that idea of storming the cenotaph, hijacked most recently by the extreme right and also by pro-Palestinian protesters who graffiti it. Actually, we were protesting and using it as a push point, a trig point in the 1920s, when the dead were fresh dead, and a million of them. So I think that idea that, nowadays we don't revere our dead or we don't understand, it's a way of kind of beating current generations with an old stick, because it was ever thus. And actually, we erect the Nelson Memorial in the 1830s because we think that it will quell social unrest. And it's used as in fact, it was the 1840s, I think. And it was used by the Chartists, the first people who decided that Nelson's Column was this kind of brilliant column or monument around which to gather, were those protesting against the government.
Which brings us back to your point about these three timelines you're looking at these monuments, is that even people watching this discussion today will see different things when they see certain monuments. And, you know, and I use for the title slide for this, the Bomber Command Monument in London, Violet Szabo, things like that, because some people will see, for example, SOE agents as a, I don't know, feminist icon, and some will just be it as a soldier and participant in World War II. I mean, Violet Szabo is both of those things. And so in your,
she was interesting.
Is in some ways your own interpretation of monuments is coming through, but you're also trying to understand a social, a cultural understand these monuments.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought me on to Violet Szabo, and I don't actually have a slide of her in this particular slideshow. I do have a Bomber Command. Let's just go to Violet Szabo, because her monument, or the monument to SOE more correctly, on Albert Embankment, is erected 1 year before the Bomber Command Memorial.
Right.
Now, I found her almost accidentally, because one of the veterans I knew who helped me with this book was a Fanny, first aid nursing yeomanry, famous, of course, for being posh girls who drove around in World War I, and then did even more than driving in World War II. They went on secret overseas missions because they were a bit posh. They were trusted not to have promiscuous behaviors with the men. Of course, sometimes they couldn't help how the men behaved back at them, but that was never really taken into consideration. Anyway, this particular Fanny, Joyce Wilding, was in fact in Britain. She worked in Tame Park initially, and she intercepted the signals coming in from the continent, and she was collecting, not translating or decoding them all, literally switching on what she called what looked like microwave ovens to pick up the transmissions. She said the worst thing was when the line went dead, you knew that they'd been dicked over the head by a Nazi and they'd been found in the field. Of course, we know when you've got your direction finder up, etc., you're more likely to be copped off by one of the enemy. But she was absolutely fascinating about commemoration, because I said, well, if you had to choose a memorial to the Second World War, she had quite a good war. You know, she said it was fascinating being at Tame Park because all these SOE operatives, I mean, they were all foreign. She said, I really liked this Norwegian aristocrat, and he liked me because I had a pony called Pinto. I mean, literally, it was like talking in a different language with Fanny Joyce. But she said, but of course, we could never know their names. And after 6 weeks, they left. And then we never knew if we were going to hear from them again. But even if we had, we wouldn't have known because we didn't know their real names. And I think, you know, we know about their life expectancy is about 13 weeks in the field. It was extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily brave, whether man or woman. They more than deserved their 2011 monument. But initially, she sends me to St. Paul's Church in Knightsbridge, which is the Fanny Church. Of course, Fanny today is still the oldest volunteer uniform female organisation in Britain, established in 1907 after the Boer War, where there's this plaque to the Fanny operatives in World War II. And I go behind the church and I make that one of my memorials. But then I plug in some of the names. And of course, one of them is Violet Szabo. And then it takes you on this journey. And I cycled across London. And I kept on finding, and it kind of annoyed me, although I'm not what I call an angry feminist. I kind of get the lag time. I get that women played a secondary role. I've examined and I understand that, you know, the traditional bedrock upon which Britain was built. Women fought wars, and they fought wars to look after women who were back. You know, men fought wars, and they fought wars to protect the idea of a peaceful idyll, including their comely wife, you know, with lactating breasts, looking after the children at home. And as soon as you say you've got to rewrite that in the Second World War, and women are going to wear uniform, you can imagine that just blew the minds of the men in the War Office. Oh my God, what are men fighting for? And so I get all the lag time and stuff, but the monumentation is fascinating because you go down Whitehall and there's Alan Brooke, Slim, Montgomery, you know, your white, great white men, Winston Churchill, the early arrival, of course, in 1973 in Parliament Square. And you sort of think, okay, and then the women come along, and Christina Granville is the first one, you know, the Polish SOE, very good books been written to her by Claire Mully. She gets a little bust ahead inside the Polish Olinsky, you know, the Polish club. And then you find Violet Szabo, and she's on the Albert Embankment, again, it's just like a head. And you think, all these men get, belt and braces, full body. And these SOE operatives, actually, Christina, I think she's got a code name, and I think, is it to call her Christina Granville? I hope is correct. But anyway, somebody will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. She actually died after the war. She was shot by a lover. But Violette Szabo, as we know, died in Ravensbrück, was shot by the Nazis, and she also just gets a head. But I actually came to love her monument because it's a head on a plinth, and because two-thirds of the monument is plinth, actually the space then to recognise all the SOE, which was, by the way, mainly populated by men.
Yeah.
SOE women were dragged in quite late, needs must. And the likes of Violette Szabo, again, a fascinating story, which I dug into, because, of course, she was a prime candidate. She was widowed. Her husband, a French freedom fighter, had been killed. So it doesn't matter that she's a mother. She's perfect because she's angry and she's bilingual. South London girl, but with a French mother, and she'd lived in France. And I loved the fact that, and this maybe is where I'm gendered, I felt there was almost something quite feminine about her generously, because she was only a head, a black-eyed bust, giving space to remember all the service that she represented. And I rather like that.
How do you feel about symbolic soldiers or sailors or airmen representing real people? Because sometimes there is a guy representing a specific person to it. So for example, in Normandy, which is where I live, there's a monument on Omaha Beach to Charles Shea, who was a Native American medic on Omaha Beach. So that it's of him and it's his face, but in turn, it's honoring all the Native Americans on D-Day. So I get that concept, but people get a bit confused by it, because they then think, but it's a monument of him, which it is, but it's also honoring a larger group, as with the Violette Szabo. So how do you kind of quantify that way of doing monuments? Is it problematic for you?
I'm going to let's talk or cast that question through the prism of two monuments. Let's go to Bomber Command a year later. So a year, if I may say, after SOE, after the Women of World War II monument, which we'll come to as the second part of answering that question. That was unveiled in 2005. So Bomber Command 2012, that's very late, for the second most fatal operative service in World War II. The most fatal, of course, was the German U-boats. That took the highest number of casualties. The second was to fly for Bomber Command. We know they wreaked untold damage. We know that nearly 400,000 German civilians were killed, but we also know that over 55,000 of Bomber Command didn't return to their beds. And they fell, and there's Colin Bell, DFC, 104 years old, actually 103 in that picture, if you're going to pick at minutiae. He and his survivors before 2012 felt overlooked. There's no doubt they felt that Churchill's famous speech, never have so many owed so few, etc., etc., the forefronting of that part of that speech, which celebrated the fighters and the RAF dogfights over the Channel, the Battle of Britain, totally wrote them out of the story, when in the same speech Churchill said, and night after night our bombers fly into Germany, as early as 1940. And they felt they'd been written out of history. And Bomber Harris, we know, when the cabinet in 1944 was feeling queasy about the extensive bombing, and it wasn't just Dresden, it was Cologne, it was Hamburg, you can list the towns, the cities, the firebombs, the people who literally were melted to death, women and children included. That was something that Bomber Harris was like. And if you ask Colin Bell and any other man who survives, and I've just been at the Bomber Command Memorial Service, they will say that's war, kill or be killed. They'll give you back that commando slogan. If you're fighting in a war, you're fighting to win. And he's unapologetic. He flew over 50 raids. And I think the lionization of the men, so you have there an air crew, inside this extraordinary sort of quasi-imperial structure, paid for by predominantly right-wing donors and right-wing press. In fact, I met Lord Ashcroft at the weekend, who gave up £1 million for it. Of course, he's still there reminding everyone. And these are massively outsized, by the way. And you can see that's me in relation to the size of the statues. But to the likes of Colin, it was catch-up. This was about remembering their service when they felt forgotten, and almost building them bigger, giving them this giant stature made up for the fact they'd been overlooked for some 70 years. Now, if you ask the left, and I did ask the left, they leant right out of this project. So rather than leaning in and finding some halfway house, which is perhaps less bombastic, less enormous, less in your face, less unapologetic, you needed the left to keep in with the narrative instead of slagging it off. But what you get, when I looked into the press in 2012, the Guardian slag it off, the Telegraph fund it. It's like dog whistle politics before we've even hit Brexit. And in a way, when I went there, and I also went there with a squadron leader from the Iraq War, he was epic. He was so helpful with the book. And he again said this, and we saw it's a live monument. It's one of the most visited monuments in London. Said, but this is a recruiting tool. You have to lionize the dead who serve for their country, because otherwise, why would they serve? Why would a boy or a girl today, when they can go and make equivalent money in computer IT or on Instagram, why would they potentially put their life on the line?
That's a very good point. And I mean, I've been to the Bomber Command Monument twice, and interesting, my visits were different, because the first time I was going there, and I was specifically thinking of a first cousin twice removed, William Bunting, who was shot down and killed in Germany as part of a Lancaster navigator. So I was thinking about it as a personal tribute to a family member who just got conscripted and got put in bombers. And then the second time I went back there, it was when I'd been doing World War II TV, and I had a much more, as you've been talking, contemplative kind of visit, thinking about strategic bombing and the results of it. So even myself, I had two completely different reactions to it on two different visits. And I think, in principle, I think you can honor individuals who do something without necessarily approving, so to speak, the concept behind it. It's like you can have a I support veterans sticker on your car if you're American, British, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to endorse your government's current policy about foreign wars. The two concepts are not they're connected, but they can be separate.
They can be, and what's slightly disappointing is this sort of pretty second-rate tack-on postscript at the back of the monument saying, and this also remembers all those killed in all bombing campaigns in World War II. But you can't compare our blitz, 60,000 dead, with the blitz that we inflicted on Germany. And I know that Germans blitzed us first, but we were clearly winning the war by 1944, late on into 1944, into 1945, and we carried on. And I think that's why there's this equivocal feeling. Incidentally, every year bar one in the last 8, it's been vandalized or graffitied. And the RAF Benevolent Fund will say, but that helps us raise money because it raises awareness that the monument's there, because it costs a huge amount of money to maintain these.
This is why this conversation is so interesting, because the right to discuss strategic bombing as a principle is something we've done on this channel. We've had all sorts of conversations. Dan Ellen is in the sidebar today about the dam busters and Operation Chastise, etc., and all that. The firebombing of Tokyo. We can have these conversations as academics, as history buffs, things like that, and they are part of, but they're also separate to the memorialization of individuals who served for their countries. And is the memorial the place to stand and have the debate as individuals about the concept of war, or you wouldn't go into a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery and in that cemetery have a debate about firebombing, would you? You would do it in a classroom environment. So we're going back to this idea: what are memorials for, and who are they for?
I'm just shutting the door because I've been rudely interrupted by a 6-year-old. There we are.
No worries.
I think that's a really good point. I think because this monument, Bomber Command, is so bombastic, it invites controversy. And on the side, on Portland Stone, Liam O'Connor, by the way, was the architect, and he's absolutely the kind of go-to individual for, and including the memorial, the memorial pillars, gates on Constitution Hill. So arguably those two speak to two different British narratives, one inclusive and Commonwealth, and the other one bombastic and Bomber Command. But nonetheless, Liam O'Connor is, if you like, the establishment individual that is invited to erect iterations to big World War II monumentation. But because it sort of flaunts the narrative, the unapologetic narrative, and on the side of the Portland Stone are all the donors from the BG, Robin Gibb, to Lord Archer, to the Telegraph, to the Daily Mail, to the Daily Express, you're kind of like, okay, so if they're owning it so publicly that they've put money up front, then I think it's okay to have a conversation around what this memorial or who this memorial is serving or speaking to. And it's not a grave. Having said that, on Memorial Day, which it was last Sunday, that wasn't the time to have that conversation. So I think there are also different times of year when you can have that conversation. Just to quickly, are we allowed to go to the World War II for Women monument?
Yeah. So before we move on there, because there's the bomber. It's interesting. The Bomber Command one has just the sidebar has exploded with all sorts of comments. I'm just going to put this like a representative because it's Stuart Burbage on a few weeks ago, talking about night fighters. The strategic bombing campaign denied my father and his sister their dad, and me, my sister, and cousins our grandfather. It meant a lot to see that memorial unveiled, and that who can argue with that? Yeah. Who can argue with?
You can argue with that. Now, arguably, if Bomber Command had got their memorial earlier, look at when the Commandos got theirs. 1952, unveiled by the icon of war commemoration, the Queen Mother. Okay, who lost her brother in the First World War, who was the first royal bride to lay her wreath at the tomb of the unknown warrior. On it goes. You know, that's where Commandos are here. And actually, I should know off by heart, and I don't in my book, when the RAF, you know, Fighter Command get their memorial, but there's a wonderful one down in Kent overlooking the coast, you know, the solitary pilot, etc. So why the lag time? And if there hadn't been a lag time, it wouldn't have needed to have been so big. It wouldn't have needed to have been proving itself in that way.
No, I mean, what you're saying is giving me a lot to think about, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation. So, and it's why we're going back to this original idea about memorials being different things to different peoples, and I guess that's okay, isn't it? It's like when the film Patton came out, some people saw it as a rip-roaring celebration of an incredible military man, and other people saw it as a sort of satirical, anti-establishment, anti-war. And the same audiences saw the same film created by Francis Ford Coppola, and they got different things from it. And that, I guess, that's broadly 100%. That's okay, isn't it? I guess that's okay. But you wanted to talk about the next monument, so back to you.
I just want to quickly say that there was a delegation that went to Dresden, etc. So there was collaboration and cooperation with Germany, who are now, of course, our allies. But it should be said, this monument's in the belly button of Britain. It's just opposite the RAF club. It's not in Germany. So it's also where a monument's located. This is talking to the man in your sidebar, remembering his grandfather, his father, etc. This is talking to him. It's not talking to the bombed of Germany and those who lost their lives.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
And here we go. Just quickly to the women of World War II. I worked with amazing Barbara. She served in the eightieth. She was amazing. She drove Bedford trucks. She went back to Yorkshire. Her husband died. Finally, decades later, she wants to remember World War II. It should be said World War II commemoration, because I teased this and didn't pin it down, takes off in the 1980s. And there's a perfect storm. The soldiers who had served in the likes of the D-Day landings, etc., were suddenly nearing retirement. So they'd become a bit dewy-eyed, remembering back to their, their youth, this extraordinary period for them, really. And also feeling, I think, they'd got to old age and a lot of men that they served with hadn't. Secondly, Margaret Thatcher at the helm, taking us on an extraordinary war against the Falklands, at the same time as she's facing down a nightmare, which she's handling pretty badly with a lot of binary language, in Northern Ireland. And it's very important, both in the context of the Falklands, this post-imperial conflict, and in the context of Northern Ireland within our own British Isles, that we write up our history as a country that fights the right wars, the moral wars. And the best example of that is the Second World War.
Yeah.
Also, you've got your great men dying, the likes of Montgomery, Harris, Churchill's already gone, etc. And you have this 40-year perfect moment. So that's when you get, for example, the D-Day Museum. I find the woman who designed that enormous embroidery, the Overlord embroidery, it was housed in a museum on the 40th anniversary. And the iterations have continued ever since. Now, some would say that was the beginning of jingoism. I find jingoism kind of negative. I think it's got pejorative overtones. I think that it's understandable in many ways that Britain was looking to recast its narrative going forward for a war that in which we had served in a unique fashion. We weren't compromised by German occupation. We had remained steadfast. It was a time that carried us across this period of empire to Commonwealth. And I think, although not everyone was in lockstep in the British Isles, it was a uniquely patriotic experience to have been in Britain at that time. And I doesn't need my forgiveness, but it certainly, I get it. I understand it. And I understand that since then, because we've infused our national narrative with broader canvases around minority ethnic service, around Commonwealth service, around women, around animals, that means that the iterations of war have continued unabated. And this is a very good example, by the way, of where those iterations don't work. This is the women of World War II. Barbara wanted a little plaque for her eightieth gun sight women somewhere, ideally in York Minster. She eventually got it, by the way. But instead, her campaign was hijacked, was grabbed onto by the British press just as the sort of sun was rising on the feminist narrative and the war narrative of women, partly because the male soldiers and veterans were beginning to die, it should be said, and women outlive men. And Betty Boothroyd takes it to the House of Commons. She, wins a sum of money on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So it goes on, so it goes on. Millions of quid, loads of campaigning and jumping on the bandwagon. Jimmy Savile was at the unveiling. This is designed by a man.
I'd forgotten that. Good grief, yeah.
Yeah, it's designed by a man. It's the uniforms of women and not their faces. And John Mills, the architect, said yes, because women hung up their uniforms at the end of war and went back into the domestic arena or back to their dull jobs. And, most female veterans didn't like this memorial precisely because of that, because they didn't want to be reminded of their anonymity. They felt seen in the war. They liked wearing a uniform. And yes, the 50s were pretty regressive for women's live and women's equality. And some of them did find themselves quite frustrated in marriages and so forth. And they wanted actually their moment in the sun. And this memorial also is an example of trying to be everything to everyone and not working. It was a campaign initially for some ATS, some female army women. And in the end, it's the catch-all for all female service, for the 7 million women who served. So it talks to everyone and therefore arguably to no one.
That's a really good point. I remember when I was members of an associate member of a Normandy Veterans Association, a bus went down from East Anglia to the unveiling of that, and the women didn't like it. They were like, "Yeah, why have we got no faces?" And there was, I remember there was something said at a speech that was echoing what you were saying, and they all went back home and had babies like they should have done. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that kind of, and thankfully this didn't last long. This women having, it was, and they felt it was tonally, tone deaf, and they was like,
tone deaf.
Yeah, thanks very much, but no, go back to where you're from. That it's interesting.
Yeah. And we don't have time right now, but perhaps we could do something around armistice, because the Bevan boys were another, they get also a monument, but even later in 2013, because at its best, what I realize is, particularly when you're talking to the contemporary generations, at its best, monumentation is personal. That is when it's its most powerful.
Right. Which actually takes us back to your cairn up in Scotland that started this off in some ways. Yes. This idea of it being, if it sticks to being a pure, heartfelt, we want to honor this person, this community, this ship, this vessel, it retains that. But if they get too big, they end up becoming something else. They become a mouthpiece for something else, which is unintentional. Well, I mean, this is
and that's why this conversation. But it's funny because this book, I'm not an art historian, I'm an oral historian. So every single monument I found an individual, a veteran, someone who infused the bricks and mortar with blood, with life, with truism. And the best place, and maybe we could do this on an Irish anniversary, was going to Northern Ireland. That was for me extraordinary. Enniskillen and the story there. So there's this, it was a massive learning curve. I've loved talking to you, Paul. Thank you so much.
No, definitely.
For having me on your show.
At its heart, what it's done is it's given people room to think about what they feel when they stand and look at a monument, and what they feel is that necessarily what the creators of the monument wanted you to feel, and what did they want you to think about it in the immediate aftermath. That's bad word of it being constructed, and were they thinking how it might be perceived generations later? Because obviously some of the people putting up monuments to Wellington didn't know there were going to be two massive great world wars that would follow, and so it meant something then. But then in the context of being part of a series of monuments, it then means something else. And, I say Normandy is becoming full of monuments. I do get to a point where I think, how many is too many? How many, if you have too many monuments, it's the Star Wars thing. I was a Star Wars fan, but now are there too many Star Wars films coming? I don't look forward to them anymore. I mean, it's a weird analogy to use, but
don't you think actually, just as Napoleon, we moved on eventually, and you can almost feel it now slipping. I felt this was really the apogee, if you like, of World War II commemoration, this 80th anniversary. And I wonder now if it'll just slip. It goes from being living history to being written history. And if anyone wants a signed copy of the book, if they could get in contact with me on social medias or something, and I'll try and sort that out. And I very much appreciate your time.
Well, people are saying fantastic, brilliant stream, excellent show, brilliant as expected. But we had a question from Jason here, which I think I'll put as the last question. Dr. Dunlop, during your visits and research, were there any memorials or monuments you found particularly striking or emotionally overwhelming in terms of design, symbolism, amount of sacrifice noted, etc.? I mean, was there one that stands out as something that you fundamentally changed you?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jason. There was one woman, Helen Lewis, who lost her son, Aaron Lewis, in Afghanistan in 2008. It was a Taliban just shot his gun into the air, and the shrapnel went up into the air and came back down and pissed him in the head and killed him. And I think talking to her, she's incredible. She set up a disability veterans charity, just kind of revamped her entire life in the wake of her son's death. I didn't even, just basic stuff I didn't know, and I felt so ignorant I didn't know. About that, if you're working in the services, you're encouraged to write a letter. Not everyone does, but that in case the worst happens, so that your family and your friends have something to go back to. And she shared that letter with me, just how important it had been for her, that he said, don't be angry with the army, don't be angry with Afghanistan, don't be angry with the government. This was my choice. This is what I wanted to do. But and it was actually Mark Francois, who's this kind of, I'd always thought of him as a bit of a caricature Brexit MP kind of bloke. And it was him that helped instigate the Aaron Lewis close in Essex, with the Aaron Lewis bench and the Aaron Lewis garden and his photograph on it. But I think more than just speaking to that one conflict, which I think we still haven't managed to resolve, even in our sort of the government website, the aims of this war were unclear. If you look at the MOD's Army Museum website. But for me, that she spoke to that greater grief, and she helped me unlock so much of the drive behind the monumentation between the wars and subsequently, and why it's important, and why, even though I sit probably on the progressive left, why I am
probably
for everyone, because I actually also lean into a military narrative, and people can't get their heads around that, because I think you can't let Putin piss on the Ukrainians, and that means we have to revere our military. And I'm sorry if you find that uncomfortable. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to go with that. And also, this book has quite a masculine cover, and I had a showdown with my publisher. I said, it's hard for me to sell that because it's masculine, and I see monumentation as being also about women's pain, and it's going to change for the paperback. But it is interesting about the way in which men will commemorate war, and it is a bit more big cock, and about the way women. So this bench in the Aaron Lewis close with the photograph of Aaron Lewis on it, for me, spoke to his mum, Helen Lewis, and that was more feminine. And in Harrow School, because of course in World War I, disproportionate number of the boys were officers, posh boys died disproportionately. This extraordinary story of Alan Fitch will come back maybe another time. And I couldn't get my head around this mausoleum, this wooden mausoleum one woman had built to her son in this posh school. And when I took the photos and showed them 100 years on to Helen Lewis, she said, I get that woman's pain. I get it. She had to put her pain somewhere. She put her pain in that mausoleum with that oil painting to her son, Alan Fitch, smoking the cigarette that will not kill him, because actually it's going to be German artillery that will kill him. And actually, war is dark, which is why we have to dress it up in pageantry, and we weaponize our royal family, and we make it glorious, because it is difficult to be secure. And as we look around us today, there's never been a more salient time to remember that.
Wow, what a fantastic way to bring this to end. And I'm already planning, I want to do a panel discussion with you, Helen Patton. I'm thinking of another person I can bring in there, and just tackle this subject of memorialization and remembrance, because it's important. And it, you know, if anyone's
It
squirming
is.
a little bit and saying, but now I'm a bit less excited about my model Sherman tank on my shelf, well, good. You know, that's ultimately that's what we're trying to do here on this channel, is get people to think about what wars really may bring and what they really do. So it's been absolutely delightful talking to you, Dr. Dunlop. So I will see you again sometime, folks. I'm back again not till next Wednesday. In fact, I've got a few days off, but I will see you all again. Buy my guest books, visit their websites, and click like and subscribe. Cheers, everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.